If you have type O positive blood, your body is carrying a record far older than your name, far older than your country, and far older than any history book ever written. For most of the 20th century, scientists treated blood type as a small medical detail, a letter on a hospital form, a code for transfusions, nothing more. But the moment modern researchers began sequencing the DNA hidden behind that single letter, the entire story shifted. Type O positive turned out to be one of the clearest fingerprints of human migration on the planet, and the deepest part of that fingerprint pointed to a place most people never expected. It pointed straight into the heart of Asia. What recent genetic studies have revealed about type O positive carriers is rewriting the way we think about ancestry, about migration, about who our true ancestors were, and about how a small group of people from the Asian continent quietly seeded their blood into nearly every population alive today. By the end of this video, you will not look at your blood type the same way again. Before we go any deeper, if you are someone who finds the hidden side of human ancestry fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This is the kind of research that mainstream coverage skips over, and we dig into it carefully and respectfully. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and let us continue. The first crack in the old understanding of blood type came in 1901, when an Austrian scientist named Karl Landsteiner noticed that some blood samples clumped together when mixed, while others stayed smooth and stable. He did not know it at the time, but he had just discovered the ABO blood group system, the most important classification of human blood ever recorded. Landsteiner found 4 basic groups: A, B, and O. For decades after that, the assumption among biologists was simple and almost intuitive. They believed type A was the oldest, the original, the ancestral form. After all, A appeared everywhere. It seemed widespread. It seemed dominant. It seemed primary. But that assumption turned out to be wrong, completely wrong. And when geneticists finally cracked open the DNA inside the ABO gene itself, the picture flipped. The ABO blood group is controlled by a single gene located on chromosome 9. That gene gives instructions for an enzyme that decides whether sugar molecules called antigens are placed on the surface of red blood cells. When scientists began mapping the global distribution of blood types, the patterns were impossible to ignore. In Western Europe, type A appears in around 40% of the population. In parts of northern India, type B reaches some of its highest concentrations on Earth. In sub-Saharan Africa, the spread is mixed but balanced. But in indigenous populations of the Americas, before any European contact, type O reached levels that astonished researchers. In some tribes, nearly 100% of individuals carried type O. Not a majority, not a large share, almost every single person. That was not a random statistical drift. That was the signature of a founder population, a small group of ancestors who carried type O and passed it down through every generation that followed. And here is where the Asian connection becomes undeniable, because every serious study of Native American origins, from skeletal evidence to mitochondrial DNA to whole genome sequencing, and they brought their blood with them. This migration is often described under what researchers call the Beringian standstill hypothesis. Across modern Asia today, type O is one of the most common blood types, though the proportions shift from region to region. In the Philippines, type O appears in roughly 45% of the population. In Vietnam, it sits near 42%. In India, especially the north, type B rises sharply, but type O still holds a strong presence. The point is not that Asia is uniformly type O. The point is that Asia carries an enormous reservoir of type O genes, and that reservoir is the source from which many global type O populations ultimately descend. When researchers compared the specific DNA sequences inside the ABO gene of type O carriers from different continents, they found something remarkable. The mutations that silence the gene are not identical everywhere. There are several different ways the gene can be broken to produce type O, and the version found most commonly in East Asian populations, often called the O01 or O02 variant in scientific literature, shows a distinct genetic signature. It carries small markers, small variations in the surrounding DNA that allow researchers to trace it backward through time. And when they did, the trail led into the deep past of the Asian continent. There is something else hidden in the DNA of type O positive Asian populations that almost no one talks about: ancient interbreeding. Modern humans who lived through Asia in the last 50,000 years did not arrive on an empty continent. They encountered other groups of humans who had been there for hundreds of thousands of years before them, Neanderthals in the West. So when you put the two systems together, when you combine the type O and the Rh positive, you arrive at a blood profile that is statistically dominant across Asia and across the populations descended from Asia. Type O positive, the most common blood type on Earth, and the blood type with the deepest Asian ancestral fingerprint. Why did type O survive so well? Researchers have proposed several answers, and the most compelling involve disease. Throughout human history, the deadliest threats to survival were not predators or war. They were infections, plagues, parasites. And blood type, it turns out, has a real and measurable relationship to how the body responds to disease. Type O carriers, on average, show a lower risk of severe complications from certain malarial strains. They show a different vulnerability profile to several bacterial infections. They appear to have a slightly modified response to viral disease, including, as more recent research has suggested, the SARS family of viruses, including the one responsible for COVID-19. None of this means type O is universally protective. It is not a shield. But across hundreds of thousands of years and dozens of plagues, small advantages accumulate. A blood type that gives you even a 1% better chance of surviving childhood when a particular disease sweeps through your village will, over enough generations, dominate the gene pool. That is one of the leading explanations for why type O reached such high frequencies in indigenous Asian populations, in their descendants in the Americas, and in many isolated communities elsewhere. It survived not because it was perfect, but because it survived just slightly better when the worst diseases came. There is, however, a price. Type O blood is associated with a higher lifetime risk of certain conditions. Stomach ulcers appear more frequently in type O carriers, particularly in connection with a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori, which thrives more easily in the stomach environments of type O individuals. There is a documented connection between type O, H. pylori, and elevated rates of gastric cancer in East Asian populations. This is one of the open questions in modern blood genetics. Why does the same blood type that may have protected our Asian ancestors from one set of diseases now expose their descendants to another? Genetics is full of these trade-offs. Nothing comes without a cost. There is also the strange case of the Bombay phenotype, discovered in 1952 in the city of Bombay, now Mumbai. This is an extraordinarily rare blood profile in which a person appears to be type O in basic testing, but is actually genetically different at a deeper level. They lack a foundational sugar molecule called the H antigen, which sits beneath the A and B antigens in normal blood. Because they have no H antigen, they cannot build A or B, even if their ABO gene would otherwise allow it. They test as O, but they are not type O in the conventional sense. They cannot safely receive standard type O blood. They can only receive blood from other Bombay phenotype donors. The condition is most common in the Indian subcontinent, where it appears at rates of around 1 in 10,000. In the rest of the world, it is closer to 1 in a million. The Bombay phenotype is a reminder that even within type O itself, there are deeper layers of genetic variation that mainstream blood typing does not capture, and many of those deeper layers trace back to South Asia. When you look at the global picture, the story of type O positive begins to look less like a medical category and more like a map of where humans came from, a map of who survived and who did not. A map of the silent migrations that took ancient Asians across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, across the islands of Southeast Asia into the Pacific, and back across the steppes into Central Asia and the edges of Europe. Every time scientists have looked carefully at the genetic structure of type O positive populations, they have found Asia in the background, sometimes recent, sometimes ancient, sometimes filtered through tens of thousands of years of migration and mixing, but always present. Recent advances in ancient DNA technology have made the story even sharper. In the past 15 years, researchers have extracted readable DNA from human remains that are 5,000, 10,000, even 40,000 years old. They have sequenced the genomes of people who lived during the Ice Age, during the rise of agriculture, during the spread of the first civilizations. And every time they have looked at ABO blood type in these ancient individuals, they have learned something new. They have found that type O was already widespread in East Asia at least 30,000 years ago. They have found that the ancestors of modern Native Americans carried even higher type O frequencies than their modern descendants. They have found that early Chinese Neolithic farmers carried distinctive type O variants that match patterns still seen in southern Chinese populations today. The DNA of the dead has confirmed what the DNA of the living already suggested. Type O positive has Asian roots that run deep into prehistory. What they found was more interesting. Type O dominated, far more than in modern populations of the same regions. It suggested that the original users of the Silk Road, before later migrations and invasions changed the genetic landscape, were heavily type O. And it suggested that type O positive carriers today, especially those with East Asian, Central Asian, or South Asian ancestry, are often descendants of those ancient trade networks. Their blood remembers paths their families forgot. There is another migration story that deserves attention here. Around 5,000 years ago, a group of seafarers from what is now Taiwan began a slow, deliberate expansion across the Pacific Ocean. Over the next several thousand years, almost every population reached by these seafarers shows elevated type O frequencies. The Polynesians, in particular, carry some of the highest concentrations of type O on Earth, alongside their indigenous American cousins. Two of the most isolated and far-flung human populations on the planet, separated by the largest ocean between them, both carrying the same ancient Asian blood signature. The ocean did not erase the inheritance. It carried it. There are also questions that DNA cannot yet fully answer. Why is type B so much more common in northern India than almost anywhere else on Earth? Some researchers believe it reflects an ancient migration from the steppes of Central Asia, where type B may have first risen to prominence. Others believe it reflects a local origin or a strong selective advantage in that region. Why is type AB, the rarest of the four main types, slightly more common in East Asian populations than in European ones? It may relate to the higher prevalence of type B in Asian populations, which mathematically increases the probability of AB offspring. Why have certain isolated populations, like some indigenous peoples of Taiwan and the Philippines, retained blood frequencies that look almost identical to ancient Asian profiles from thousands of years ago? Probably because they have remained relatively isolated, with less genetic mixing than mainland populations that absorbed wave after wave of migration. Each of these questions is a thread that researchers are still pulling on, and every thread, eventually, leads back to the Asian origin story. The Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA, the two parts of the human genome that pass down in unbroken lines from father to son and mother to daughter, add their own layers to this story. East Asian populations carry distinct Y chromosome haplogroups, particularly those labeled O and C in scientific classification, that link them to ancient Asian ancestors who lived between 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. On the mitochondrial side, East Asian women carry haplogroups labeled D and M, which have their own deep roots in the Asian continent. When researchers cross-reference these ancient lineages with ABO blood frequencies, they find that the populations carrying the oldest and most ancestral Asian Y and mitochondrial lineages are also the populations with some of the most stable and ancient type O frequencies. The blood type, the male line, and the female line all tell the same story. They all point home to Asia. There is a deeper, almost philosophical layer to all of this. Blood type is something we inherit without choosing. We do not earn it. We do not select it. It is given to us at the moment of conception by genes our ancestors carried, and those ancestors received it from their ancestors, and so on, back through the long, unbroken chain of human existence. To know that your type O positive blood traces back to ancient Asia is not simply a fact about chemistry. It is a piece of inherited memory, a whisper from people who lived tens of thousands of years before any of us were born. Every red blood cell in your body carries a sugar pattern, or in the case of type O, the absence of one, that was set by those ancestors. You are walking around with their decisions, their adaptations, their survival. Modern medicine continues to find new connections between blood type and health. Type O positive carriers tend to show slightly lower rates of certain cardiovascular conditions, particularly in connection with blood clotting factors. They have, on average, slightly thinner blood, which reduces some clotting risks, but increases vulnerability to severe bleeding in certain injuries. They show distinct patterns of attraction to mosquitoes, which has implications in regions where mosquito-borne diseases are common. The full picture is still emerging. What seems clear is that blood type is not a trivial feature of biology. It is woven into the immune, circulatory, and digestive systems, and the long evolutionary history of how humans adapted to specific environments. The story of type O positive is also a story of disease pressure and survival. When researchers look at the global map of ABO frequencies and overlay it with the historical map of major epidemics, patterns emerge. Regions hit hardest by certain plagues often show, generations later, distinctive shifts in blood type frequencies. Populations that survived smallpox waves carry one set of patterns. Populations that survived bubonic plague carry another. Populations that survived the brutal disease environments of tropical Asia, where parasitic and bacterial threats were constant, carry distinctive blood type signatures that reflect those ancient battles. Type O positive, in many of these regions, ended up overrepresented not because it was chosen, but because the people carrying it survived just slightly better when survival was the only currency that mattered. What does all of this mean for someone alive today who looks at their medical chart and sees the letter O followed by a plus sign? It means that your blood is older than any nation, older than any flag, older than any border drawn on any map. It means that your ancestors, whoever they were and wherever they came from, walked through a story of survival that stretches back tens of thousands of years and that very likely passed through the heart of Asia at some point in its journey. It does not mean that you are Asian or that anything about your identity should be redefined. It means that the deep history of human migration touched your bloodstream, and that the touch came from a continent whose role in the human story has often been underappreciated by Western histories of ancestry. Asia did not just contribute to the human story. In many ways, Asia anchored it. The next time you donate blood, the next time you see your blood type on a hospital form, the next time you fill out a medical detail and write down the letters O and the plus sign, remember that you are not just describing a chemistry. You are pointing at a thread that runs back through every ancestor who ever lived in your line. A thread that does not begin in any hospital or clinic. A thread that begins in caves and grasslands and river valleys tens of thousands of years ago, in a continent where survival was hard and where the people who endured passed their blood forward to you. You are the result of that endurance. You are the living echo of that survival. And the DNA inside your red blood cells is, in a quiet and unassuming way, one of the most ancient artifacts you will ever carry. Science is still in the early stages of understanding what blood type really means. The genetic studies are getting more precise every year. Ancient DNA is getting easier to extract and read. New connections between blood type and disease, blood type and migration, blood type and human adaptation are being published every few months. The picture is becoming clearer, and what is becoming clear is this. Type O positive is not just the most common blood type on Earth. It is one of the most important historical signatures the human body carries. It is a record of the populations who walked out of Asia tens of thousands of years ago and spread across every continent. It is a record of who survived and who did not. It is a record of the long battle between humans and disease, and of the small genetic adjustments that allowed our species to keep going when so many others did not. Your blood is not just a fluid that moves through your veins. It is a map, a timeline, a library. And inside the cells of every type O positive carrier on Earth, there is a story written in chemistry and inherited from ancestors who would be astonished to know that their descendants would one day be able to read it. That story is still being read. That story is still being decoded. But the broad outline is already clear. And the broad outline points, again and again, to Asia, to the long migrations out of the East, to the small genetic tweaks that gave certain ancestors a slightly better chance of surviving the next winter, the next plague, the next famine, to the quiet, persistent passing down of a blood type that would, in the end, become the most common one on the planet. If you carry type O positive blood, you carry a piece of that history inside you. You carry the inheritance of survivors. You carry the genetic signature of one of the deepest and longest journeys any human population has ever made. And now, because of modern DNA science, you finally have the tools to know what your blood has been trying to tell you all along. Your ancestry is older than you imagined. Your origins are deeper than you were taught. And somewhere in the long line behind you, an ancient Asian survivor passed forward a quiet, persistent letter and a small plus sign that would one day end up on your own chart, in your own life, in your own time. Thank you for spending this time with us. The history written in your blood is real. The science is real. And the story, the long and beautiful story of where you come from, is only beginning to be told.